So today I am here with Emily Bender. When I first heard about your work, it was about ChatGPT, the chatbot from OpenAI that was released, I guess, late last year. What does linguistics have to do with artificial intelligence?
Yeah. So artificial intelligence, first of all, isn't really a thing, but that word is used as a marketing term and also to refer to an area of study within computer science where it's also a marketing term. It was developed in the 1950s by John McCarthy to attract funding. But if you think about trying to build technology where you can interface with computers using natural language, then you're talking about natural language processing, and then linguistics, which is basically the science of how language works, is a really important component. So that's one thing it has to do with it. The other thing is understanding how language works is really key to understanding the sleight of hand and other sort of quackery that's going on with large language models. And so that's part of why I'm using my expertise in linguistics to speak out in this way.
So, right, you said language model, and that's the phrase we all started seeing when ChatGPT came out. And I said, well, actually, I'm a language model. What is a language model, and especially a large one? Because it always says it's a large language model.
Yeah. Okay. So language model is the name for a kind of technology that is designed to model the distribution of word forms in text. And the really old language models were called n-gram language models. And you'd grab some collection of text called a corpus and just count up the words. And so a unigram language model is the relative frequency of all the different kinds of words in the text. And if you think about old spell check, where first you just got the squiggle, and then you got some possible things it might have been, and then you got the possible things it might have been ranked by likelihood, that's a language model at work. So the very first ones are just like, okay, well, which words are more likely than other words? But then there's, you could do a bigram language model. Given one previous word, what's the relative likelihood of all the other words? And so on. What we have now, so things like the generative pre-trained transformer, are bigger in terms of the amount of data they're storing and the amount of data they're trained on, language models. So the whole thing is just designed around modeling the distribution of word forms in text. They're called large language models because they have both very large numbers of parameters, that is, the weights that they're using to store the information.
Right.
And by information, again, I just mean information about the distribution of word forms in text.
Yeah.
And also absolutely enormous training data. So just large swaths of text taken from wherever it can be grabbed. Now, it's not the whole internet. And this is something I hear a lot. People say it was trained on the whole internet. That's not a thing. The internet is not something that you can go get somewhere.
Download a copy. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But it is trained on a lot of text that is indiscriminately collected.
Okay. All right. I'm going to come back to that. Before we talk about what the computers do with the language, for humans, right, for you and me, what's the function of language? What are we using it for?
Well, we use language for a lot of things. I think its primary function is face-to-face communication, which that itself is something that's important for building relationships, for building our sense of self, for building societies, for building systems of rules, for playing games. Language is just inherent in almost everything we do, or can be added on, right? I just went for a jog. That doesn't require language, but I was listening to a podcast while I did it. That does, right?
Yeah. A lot of that answer was really straightforward and clear to me. I'm curious to hear you say more about having the people in the room whose data was brought into the training material. What are the ramifications of that? What do you have in mind?
Yeah, so I'm thinking in particular of what happened with the crisis text line, where the texts that people sent in moments of crisis to the crisis text line were repurposed as training data, I believe, for trying to make virtual sales assistants more empathetic.
Wow.
Right, which is just hugely unethical. And we are in a moment right now where somehow as a society, we have gotten excited about building things out of big data. And so given a pass to the big data collectors to amass these data sets that if you take a step back, you think, no way is that actually an appropriate thing to do. Yeah. And part of the problem is that prior to digitized everything, much of our lives was ephemeral. Right? If you meet somebody on the corner and have a conversation, you might each both remember that. Somebody might have overheard it. But for that conversation to persist, it has to be someone talking about their memory of it. Right. If you have a conversation that's being recorded in any form, including if texting, then it's there as data that can actually be revisited and collected and used. And I don't think our regulatory system has really caught up to that.
Yeah. Right. So, okay. I've got more questions about the intake of this data, but going back to use cases, I think the use case that seems to be the one showing up most in my face right now is the presentation of these text generators as information desks, where I show up and I say, here's my question, and I'm given an answer. What's a metaphor, if any, that can help people understand what's happening? How can we show people what the system is really doing?
One of my favorite ones is actually the Magic 8 Ball, if you remember that
Okay,
toy.
for sure.
So, you shake this plastic toy, and there's a die inside that's got various answers written on it. And so you pose a question like, is it going to rain today? And it might say something like, unclear, ask again later, which is a response that works for any question,
Yep.
or something like signs point to yes, which only works if you've asked a yes/no question. And so when you're playing with this toy, you sort of quickly get into the habit of asking yes/no questions so that you don't get incoherent dialogues like, what should I have for lunch? Signs point to yes, which doesn't work. And I think it's helpful to think of ChatGPT and the like as similar. We are sending in questions so that we can make sense of the output, but the output isn't answering our question. We might as well be asking the Magic 8 Ball.
Right. But it really feels like it is. You get this? Yeah.
Yeah, it really feels like it is. I've got one more metaphor for you in case this
Yeah.
helps. Do you remember playing the game on early smartphones where you would say, start typing a text message, I'm sorry, I'm late, and then just hit the middle suggestion over and over again?
Yes.
Did you ever play that? Yeah. And your answer, what you got on your phone was different from what someone else playing the phone game got on their phone because there's some local data stored about your text frequency, right? And we understood that as reflecting how we used our own phones, and so it was funny.
Yeah.
That's what ChatGPT is doing, except that it's not just our data, it's whatever data they were able to collect off of the internet, plus some crowdsourced, have people write dialogues stuff going on. So not a source of information, but really, really compelling, like you said. And that's because it is so fluent. It is designed so thoroughly mimic the use of language in a certain register, right? I mean, you can make it, you can say, please talk like a teenager at the mall, and then maybe get it to move a little bit. But its default is going to be this sort of authoritative, friendly information source, because it was built that way. And prior to this, for the most part, if we ever encountered well-formed text in the wild, it's because some person had written it.
Right.
That's not true anymore. The other part of it is the way we understand language in all of our uses of language is not by sort of directly decoding the signal in the words. Might seem like it, but that's not what's going on. What's going on is we are collectively building a common ground between us, or if it's asynchronous, we're imagining a common ground. And then saying, all right, given that common ground, given what I know about that other person, what were they likely trying to communicate by picking those words? In other words, we are imagining a mind behind the text in order to understand it. And we apply those same skills when we see the output of ChatGPT.
Right.
Which is hard. And on top of that, OpenAI is leaning into it. They are not sort of guarding against our tendency to anthropomorphize. For example, there's absolutely no reason the chatbots should use first-person pronouns. It shouldn't say, I'm a language model.
Right.
It should say, this is a language model.
If we, I'm just processing all that. It's so, there's a lot going on that makes me feel uneasy. And not only are there there's bad metaphors in place that push us to misunderstanding. There's cognitive biases where it's like, this thing seems to speak English. There's probably a brain in there. And as you say, it feels like there's sort of a coercive element of yes, and we're leaning on that to get an outcome that the producer wants. With all that in place, what can everybody who has to go deal with the internet, what can we do to make informed decisions about how, and it sounds like maybe whether, to engage with these language model systems at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Like, I make a point of not reading synthetic text because why would I spend my time that way? I understand that people had some fun playing with it, but partially because of the public scholarship that I do, I got bombarded with people suggesting that I read this, that, and the other output, especially in the early days. It's like, no, I have better things to do with my time. I think it's really important to keep reminding ourselves that synthetic text is not an information source, that the only thing that ChatGPT has information about is the distribution of words in text.
Yeah.
And holding that in mind is hard, especially when it seems so plausible, but that's one thing. And then another thing is to really work towards transparency. So to say, we have a right to know when we've encountered synthetic text. That right is not being upheld in the
Right.
moment. But we can insist on it and we can individually work towards it, right? So if you are going to share some information, you can, investigate its provenance. Where did this come from? And then share that metadata along with the information. Right? So sort of overtly valuing authenticity, I think, is really important.
On the subject of citation, beyond just me as a person citing the non-synthetic source I gave to you, an argument I've seen a number of times is people saying, well, the generated text will be more authentic. Well, that's the wrong word. I'm sorry. The generated text will be more trustworthy if the language model can cite its sources. Is putting aside what you've said, which is basically look at statistics, it's not a researcher. Can it do that? If we look at the model, is it built in such a way that we can inspect the answer?
No, absolutely not. You can build it to output sources, but that's not the same thing as citing its sources. That's okay, what's a likely string to come here? And there's all these stories of ChatGPT making up citations, and then people going to the library and saying, I need to find this work. ChatGPT said it's a thing, and the librarian's going, actually,
Right.
it was just made up. And then, of course, there's the whole story of the lawyer who got in trouble by asking ChatGPT for some precedent case law, and it happily output something that looked like precedent case law. So, no, it is not. It's not a big database of information about the world or about things people have said about the world. It's a big database, roughly. Not quite the right term, but
Sure.
of information about which words tend to co-occur with other words. Sorry. Stumbling over. It's a big database or collective information about which words tend to co-occur with which other words in its training data.
Okay. So now we've got this idea that someone, I won't say we because I hope you and I have not done this, someone has built a so-called information desk where we can go and pose a question and be given an answer. And we've established here that the answer is not, the answer cannot have a straight line from raw material to a reason to believe this answer. But people are in a position to take that as the truth. And we haven't built this corpus from the whole internet, but it seems like some large swath of indiscriminately gathered data. What are the dangers to the consumers of this data based on where the corpus came from?
Yeah. So one of the things that happens in representing the distribution of words in text is you are going to get reflections of various kinds of social biases. So one example that I associate with Meg Mitchell is the phrase woman doctor is actually far more frequent in English than the phrase man doctor, because even though the medical profession is actually not so gender skewed at this point, it is still treated in our discourse as an unusual thing for a doctor to be a woman.
Right.
And conversely, no one says a woman nurse or a female nurse, but you definitely hear man nurse or male nurse,
Right.
because of perceptions of how those professions are populated. And that's a pretty mild example, but those kinds of distributional biases are in there, and you're going to then get them in the output. And if you're using that output to create fiction, where you don't particularly care about, you're not taking it as true claims about the world, like which events happened or didn't happen, but we don't expect facts in fictional stories, but we do expect truths about the world. right? And so if we're generating stuff that we're understanding to be entertainment, we're understanding to be fiction, but it is reproducing various patterns and systems of oppression, that's bad.
Right.
And the less care we put into curating training data, the more of that there's going to be.
And what does curating the data look like? Like, do we enforce reverse biases? Can we eliminate? Can we choose the biases we want, which feels like maybe a manipulative problem?
Right. So first of all, there's no such thing as an unbiased data set. And secondly, picking without thinking about that is not the neutral stance. Right? There's no neutral stance here. The way to curate a data set is to think about, okay, what's the purpose that I'm building this for? And then what kind of data would be appropriate? Who are the people who need to be in the room? Whose viewpoints are going to be affected here? Or viewpoints isn't the right word there. Whose lives are going to be impacted by the use of this technology? And what does that mean about how we want to design our data set and then test it for various biases? Abebe Barhane points out that machine learning as a practice is inherently conservative in the sense that it is an implementation of taking patterns from the past and using them to affect the future.
Right.
So if we are going to be using pattern recognition or synthetic media to do things in the future, we should do it in terms of the future we want to build, and not in terms of just like, well, this is how the world is, so we're just going to keep doing that.
Yes. And I think that there's a next order problem, which is a thing that's been on my mind a lot, which is there are these models that are taking in large amounts of search results and building a predictive text model to generate more text for us. And then we ask it questions, and it gives us an answer with no citation, no paper trail back to where it came from. But meanwhile, it sure seems like people are producing a lot of synthetic text to publish on their blog, on sources of information, which I would assume are now being reconsumed into the next order of text generation. And at some point, it seems like there's a vicious cycle that I would expect of blurring of information. Is there a solution? Is something prevent that?
So I think the solution would require watermarking at the source so that we can definitively filter, or to a high degree of accuracy, filter the stuff that's come from the synthetic media machines. And yeah, it's all over the place. So there's, I don't know if they've been taken down or not, but for a little while at least, there were synthetic text mushroom foraging guides that were being published on Amazon as if they were actual books.
That sounds dangerous.
Yes, very dangerous. And there was something like, I don't know if this is still there either, but if you search on Google, name a country in Africa that starts with K. What came back was this absurd statement: there are no countries in Africa that start with K. And if you click through, that was a ChatGPT output that someone had posted on some site somewhere, and it became somehow the first Google hit. So yeah, the way out of this is insisting on transparency. They're basically setting up a regulatory regime where you can always tell that you've hit synthetic media, and so therefore you can, on a one-by-one basis, spot it and know it, but also systematically filter it out. Just like you might have an ad blocker on your browser, you could have a synthetic media blocker.
That sounds great. Knowing what came from a person and what came from a random number generator sounds good. But I have read, I hesitate to say articles, I've read stuff on the internet where I've seen people discussing the idea that students are now passing in work where they've said, please write my term paper. And the countermeasure is that the professors will take the work and pass it to a synthetic text detector. How does that work?
Not well.
Okay.
Those synthetic text detectors are not accurate, and it's not a good pedagogical practice to be policing students in that way, I don't think. The sort of most famous story was a professor at Texas A&M who last spring suspected his students of using ChatGPT to write assignments, and so he asked ChatGPT if it had written those assignments, and ChatGPT said yes, and he failed the students.
Wow.
Which really means he failed to understand the technology that he was working with. But there's repeatedly stories of people who are being falsely accused because some instructor put their homework into one of these machines and it said, yep, this one's fake. And then the students have really no recourse. So that's not the way out of it. Part of what's going on there is there's no watermarking at the source. Right? If we had a definitive tag that things came along with, now people are still going to try to remove watermarks. There is some really interesting proposals. One of the authors is Tom Goldstein, and the paper was at ICML this year for how to put in a much more difficult to remove watermark as opposed to just like some text at the beginning.
Right.
So it is possible to, I think, do more than is being done in terms of marking things at the source. There are always going to be bad actors who create these systems and don't embed the watermarks, but that doesn't mean that it should just be a free-for-all, right? If we think in terms of the pollution metaphor and pollution of the information ecosystem, having some oil companies doing oil spills doesn't mean that other oil companies are off the hook and can just spill
Right.
away, right?
Yeah. Okay. You wrote a paper with Tim Nickebrew called "On the Danger of Stochastic Parrots," and that came out in 2021. And that was before ChatGPT sort of blew up and made it feel like a watershed event for large language models on every website. And reading that paper, the sentiment seemed to me, hey, everyone, we should be careful in what we're doing. And looking at the internet today, I feel like, well, the genie has been let out of the bottle. And as you say, we can't, that doesn't mean we can do nothing, right? There's someone is spilling oil. That's bad. Everyone else should stop. But what are the things we can do?
Yeah, so I think we really do have to look to regulation. And another environmental example that I like to point to is the ozone layer, right? That was really bad in the 1980s. We had a huge problem with the hole in the ozone layer because of technology that had been developed and was being widely used. And we put in regulations and we stopped. And we fixed that. Similarly, we had a lot of problem with lead pollution because of leaded gasoline. Put in regulation, it was ubiquitous, it was embedded in the infrastructure, and now it's basically gone. So we can do this. It takes a lot of collective political will, but we can do it. And yeah, it's certainly not fun to be in the position of having written a paper. We wrote the paper in late 2020, and it was published in March of 21, saying, hey guys, don't do this, it's a bad idea, and then having it happen anyway is not fun. But I'm also not giving up. I think that we need regulation, we need accountability. So one of my regulation like dream items would be, what if a person or organization that sets up a synthetic media machine is actually accountable for what it says as if they had said it themselves?
Right.
That would
Okay.
change things in a big hurry.
Yeah. Who are the people, who are the agencies in the world that would need to be on board with this kind of regulation?
I think we're talking about national governments and then possibly something at the supranational level. And I know there's a lot of conversation now happening about regulation. Some of it is nonsense about existential risk. But there's also the US FTC is doing great work. Lena Khan is amazing, saying, hey, it's our job to regulate the activities of businesses. And just because they're using automation, so-called AI, to do those activities doesn't take it out of our jurisdiction. So there's a lot that can be done. The lawyer who queried ChatGPT for precedent case law and then submitted it got in trouble because he's working in a well-regulated area.
Right.
So I think the question is, all right, where is there not yet enough regulation, and whose jurisdiction does it fall under? And that needs to be done, I think, country by country, and then probably also at an international level.
What is it that's going to prevent? There's a lot of stuff on the internet that regulation tells us shouldn't be there. There's pirated material, there's hate speech, there's instructions on how to commit crimes. Is that an indication that we're always going to have synthetic text posing as real text, and regulation isn't going to stop it? And this is back to our less is better than all. How do we think about this?
Yeah, I think this is not going to be something that we could ever get rid of 100%. But that's one of those things where less is definitely better than all. That's most things in life, right? I've spent some time thinking about what would be a safe and beneficial use case of synthetic text, and that's hard.
Okay.
So it would have to be a case where either it's really only about the form, you don't care about the content, or the content can be effectively and thoroughly vetted. It would have to be a case where you're not concerned about plagiarism and setting up someone else's ideas as your own. It would have to be a case where the kinds of biases that are going to come out either don't matter somehow or, again, can be thoroughly mitigated. And it would have to be a case where you don't care about the data theft and labor exploitation that underlies the system.
Right. Okay.
Or you found one of these where that's not true. So that really narrows things. If we assume that it's a so some of my candidate cases, sort of assuming we have a version of this that was built without data theft and labor exploitation, the other criteria you think might be satisfied in like a dialogue partner for a language learner or non-playable character in a video game. But there we're again really concerned with biases, right?
Right.
It's not, even though, yes, I don't think I'm getting real information there, there's still going to be this like, oh, that's how we talk about the world in this language, or that's
Right.
the world this video game creator has produced. So one of the better ones that I have come across is tip of the tongue searches, where
Okay.
what you're searching for is the name of the thing and you can describe it, but you don't know what it's called.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds great.
Yeah, that's really hard to do with a regular search engine. That's an idea that came to me from Daniel Midgley. So that seems like a good use case, partially because then you could immediately turn around and do a regular search on that term.
Yeah.
Again, provided you've gotten an ethically produced one of these things.
Right.
That's super narrow, right? Oh, we haven't even talked about the environmental impact of building these. I mean, so they are, data centers involve an enormous amount of power and water usage.
Right.
And, that's going to involve carbon footprint. And even if they're running off of renewable energy, well, that's renewable energy that couldn't be used for something else because we don't have yet a capacity for more renewable energy than we actually need. So you put all of that in to get something that helps you with tip of the tongue searches? Like, I'm just not convinced. Now, language models that are used for classification rather than text synthesis definitely have a role, right? This is part of automatic speech recognition. If you want good automatic transcription, a larger language model is going to help. You want
Oh,
good machine
interesting.
translation, it's going to help. You want good, summarization's kind of on the border because the way these things are used for summarization can certainly input a bunch of artifacts that aren't there in the thing you're summarizing. But that kind of language technology is made better with better language models. I believe we have overshot the size of language model that is really helping with that.
Right.
Again, especially given environmental concerns, especially given the inability to collect the data carefully at these scales. But there are certainly positive use cases for language models, and even larger language models, just not when they're being used to create synthetic text.
Right. Okay. Well, that's good. I'm glad it was built for. It can do something good that we built it for. Okay, so the show that you are on right now is Digital Citizen, and we talk about digital citizenship. And that's, to us, is how we engage with each other online and how we engage with the culture that exists online. And one of the sort of central questions for us is what can we do as individuals or as parts of that community to be better digital citizens? And I wonder if you have advice on that topic.
So one thing is just being mindful of the fact that synthetic media is not information and that nobody has accountability for it. Unfortunately, I'd love to fix that. And so keeping that in mind as one goes about their day, on the internet, I think can be really helpful. I would say it is an act of good citizenship to avoid using products that are built on data theft and labor exploitation. That is another kind of relationship that's worth being careful about. I think we can, at an individual level, insist on transparency, sort of moving around with the expectation that we should be able to know when we've encountered synthetic media, even if that's not presently the case. I think that leads us to ask good questions. And then, sort of as the counterpoint to that, we can, again, on an individual level, build up the value of authenticity and make a point of insisting on data provenance. And this, again, not that new, right? If you think about the way misinformation flies around social media, one way to counter that is to not share something if it's not citing its sources.
Right.
And similar habits, I think, of what you might call information hygiene apply here as well.
Yeah. I am reminded of what you said about holding the text synthesizers creators responsible for the synthesized text. Maybe we can hold ourselves responsible for what we share and understanding what's going on there.
Yeah, that's a good practice. And I think to get out of this, we are going to need collective action and regulation. And I really appreciate the efforts towards building information literacy. That's a key component, but I don't want it to be the only solution that we're putting in place, because you can't
Right.
sort of good behavior your way out of these kinds of structural problems. Though certainly good behavior can help, and it can help both in terms of it's actually helping the larger problem, and it helps keep one's spirits up to have positive things that you can do.